Hello and welcome to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John. I'm joined today by one of our writers, Randall Balmer, who has written a piece for us recently, a tribute to the late Jimmy Carter. So we're going to be talking about that article and about Jimmy Carter's presidency and legacy. Before we dive into those topics, Randall, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Randall Balmer. I'm an Episcopal priest and also a professor of religion at Dartmouth College, where I study and teach American religious history.
That's great. Well, thanks for joining us and thanks for writing this excellent essay about Jimmy Carter. First, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with President Carter. You mentioned in the article at one point your first meeting with him and you described it. So it seems like you had maybe more meetings after that. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship.
I did. I first became aware of Mr. Carter when I was an undergraduate student at Trinity College, Deerfield, Illinois. And he burst on the scene and proclaimed that he was a born-again evangelical Christian. And that was the language that I used to describe myself. And I was quite taken with this. I thought this was really quite remarkable that somebody would say this as a national politician, but also not be ashamed of it. We were kind of furtive about it when we identified ourselves, but he was very forthright. So that began my interest in Mr. Carter. And then uh, I guess later in my career, I suppose sometime in the 1990s, I decided that I really wanted to write a biography of Jimmy Carter. And I wanted to write a biography that took his faith seriously, precisely because he took his faith seriously. And I thought this would be the way to really portray him in a way that other biographers have not. And so I started at least thinking about this. I got in touch with the Carter Center and the policy of Mr. Carter at that time, and I think ever since, until his death, was that he wanted scholars to pretty much do all of their research first, and then he would have a conversation with them. And so that's what I did. But my first meeting actually with Carter was at Emory University prior to an event, and a small group of people, and he wanted to talk about the unsurpassed joy of telling people about Jesus. And that was what was important to him. And then I had several other meetings with him, lunch when I was an assistant, visiting professor at Emory University. He invited me to lunch at the Carter Center. We had a conversation then. And then a final interview when I had pretty much finished writing the biography. And I went to his Sunday school class at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, and then afterwards we had a conversation about the manuscript. So he was always very kind, very congenial. He's a reserved man. He's not somebody who warms up easily. I actually, in the course of writing the biography, I determined there were kind of two poles of presidential personality. There's Jimmy Carter on the one side, and there's Bill Clinton on the other side, and they couldn't be more different in terms of personality.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the focus of the book largely was Carter's faith. And speaking of that, you talk about his faith a bit in the essay for the century, and you describe it as a progressive evangelicalism that has all but disappeared from view. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more, maybe situate his faith within the landscape of the church in the US and like why and how did this expression of the faith disappear from view?
Oh, it's a long story. I'll try to do the abbreviated version of it. But first of all, when you look at evangelicalism back in the 19th century, particularly in the antebellum period, evangelicals were very much concerned about those on the margins of society. They were concerned to address the needs of those Jesus called the least of these. So they were involved in prison reform. They were very much in favor of public education, known as common schools at that time, as a way to lift the prospects of those in the lower classes of society. They were involved in various peace crusades. And very importantly, they supported women's equality, including voting rights, which in the 19th century was a fairly radical idea. And so this strain of progressive evangelicalism continues throughout the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century. And the issues shift a little bit by that point. The rights of workers to organize, for example, was considered important by many evangelicals. That's not to say there wasn't a conservative backlash that took place, especially in the early decades of the 20th century. There's no question there was. But this strain of progressive evangelicalism really survives into the 1970s. And an important moment there is something called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, which was drafted by 55 evangelical leaders, theologians in Chicago at the YMCA Hotel on Wabash Street in November of 1973. And what's remarkable about this document is that it really um, brings again to the surface the very principles that evangelicals in the 19th century had been working on. So that occurs, and then 6 months later, roughly 6 months later, Jimmy Carter delivers his famous Law Day address at the University of Georgia Law School, where he talks about how he understood justice. He quoted um, Reinhold Niebuhr's famous dictum that the sad duty of politics was to establish justice in a sinful world. And this is a phrase that Carter repeated many, many times throughout his career. And he also talked about the second theologian who had influenced his thinking, the venerable theologian Bob Dylan, especially Bob Dylan's song "Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More," about the plight of tenant farmers. And then he went from there into a riff about the corruptions in Washington. This, of course, was at the end or toward the end of the Watergate scandal. And he talked about the importance of tending to the needs of those on the margins of society. So in many ways, I think Jimmy Carter's election in 1976 represented the zenith, the high point of progressive evangelicalism. And then to get to the point of your question, what happened? Again, it's a rather long story, but the short version is that evangelicals turned dramatically against Jimmy Carter, one of their own, a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, in favor of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And that began this long process of intertwining um, white evangelicalism with the far right reaches of the Republican Party. So, is there progressive evangelicalism still around? And by the way, in my final conversation with Mr. Carter, he was happy to be identified by that term. He said that he was comfortable being called that, even though Southern Baptists don't like the term evangelical. They consider it a Yankee term. He was fine with that. Um, but yes, progressive evangelicalism is still around. We just lost Tony Campolo about a month before Mr. Carter died. He was a major spokesman for that movement. You have the Sojourners movement. Jim Wallace himself, who has since now moved on to Georgetown University. Shane Claiborne would be part of that. Uh, there's a strong element of progressive evangelicalism. The problem is, and actually Jim and I talked about this just a few days ago at the memorial service for Tony Campolo. The problem is that progressive evangelicals don't know how to get their message out as effectively as the right wing and white evangelicalism or the religious right.
Mm, thanks, Randall. It's funny. I just saw the movie A Complete Unknown about a segment of Bob Dylan's career, and I saw Timothy Chalamet perform "Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More." I did not know how influential the song was to Jimmy
It
Carter, so
was.
that's an interesting tidbit.
Yeah.
Finally, wanted to ask you about this another topic you mentioned in your writing, which is the reevaluation of Carter's
Yeah.
presidency that's happening right now among historians. One of the explanations you gave for this, quoting from your essay, you said the partisan gloss his political adversaries had painted has begun to fade. I wonder if you could tell us more. Was it just a matter of time for that gloss to fade, or are there some other factors you think that are causing people to give Carter's presidency another look now?
It's really a great question. I think part of it is simply cyclical. Historians, every few years or a generation, however you define a generation, we kind of circle back and we say, well, let's ask some of these same questions again, and maybe from the perspective of history, things begin to look a little bit different. And in the case of Carter's presidency, there's really a widespread appreciation for what he did. He really was a remarkable presidency. In terms of faith and religion, again, this is one of the emphases of my biography. He recognized that if the United States was to have any meaningful relationship with third world countries, particularly Latin America, we needed to move away from our colonialism. And so, at great political cost to himself, he renegotiated the Panama Canal treaties because he thought that was the right thing to do. And I think history has borne that out. It was the right thing to do. He sought to move American foreign policy away from the reflexive Cold War dualism toward an emphasis on human rights. And people around the world have credited him with freeing tens of thousands of political prisoners because of his emphasis on that. He appointed more women and people of color to federal jobs, including judgeships, than all of his predecessors combined. And many people regard him as the greatest environmental president ever for the amount of land that he put into the federal government and to keep it from development. So those are some of the things that historians are beginning to look at. Beyond that, economically, deregulation. If you are a craft beer aficionado, as I am, we have Jimmy Carter to thank for that because he loosened regulations regarding the production of beer. Airline deregulation, trucking deregulation, so forth. Many things economically that really, again, look much better in hindsight than they did at the time. So that's part of what's happening. And in terms of the partisan gloss, Reagan won in 1980, of course, and it's remembered as a landslide, and it was in terms of the Electoral College. But what people forget is that going into that final weekend of that campaign, Carter and Reagan were neck and neck in the polls. And what really torpedoed his candidacy or his reelection was the fact that the taking of the hostages in Iran took place exactly 1 year prior to Election Day in 1980. And so the media were playing that up in advance of Election Day, and his favorability ratings just plummeted over that final weekend. But the Reagan administration was very effective in a lot of economists have argued, really engineering a recession. And Carter was so unpopular at that point that they were able to blame it on him, even though his economic policies really did set the stage for a long-term economic recovery. I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit, but that's a part of the answer to your question. I think the third element is that, frankly, the Trump presidency, both the current presidency and the previous presidency, Americans are beginning to appreciate Jimmy Carter a little bit more. And one of the things that I learned as an evangelical growing up, and I expect you probably did as well, is the importance of telling the truth. And Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 in large part because he promised that he would never knowingly lie to the American people. And I think what's terribly remarkable about his presidency is that in his 4 years in the White House, no one has credibly charged him with breaking that pledge. He didn't lie. Now, as I'm sure you know, the Washington Post during the Trump first presidency did fact checking, and they determined that in the course of a 4 year presidency, Donald Trump issued 30,573 false or misleading statements. And I'm going to let that sink in for a moment here. Jimmy Carter, zero. Donald Trump, in 4 years, 30,573 false or misleading statements. So I think that's another reason why Jimmy Carter and his presidency as being reevaluated and looked on far more favorably than that it was in, say, the 1980s.
Yeah, wow, thank you. So much to think about. Really helpful stuff. Anyone out there, if you did not catch this article, check it out below in the video description. We'll have a link both to this article in the Christian Century that Randall wrote, also a link where you can buy his biography of Jimmy Carter. Thank you so much for chatting today, Randall.
My pleasure. Thanks, John.